In today's video, I'm going to restore this old turtle stool that I found at an estate sale. It was up in the attic with some other stuff on top of it. That's where that dent comes from on the leather, and missing a leg. So, all said, it was $5 for this and a couple of cans of polyurethane, which thankfully were still good. So I originally labeled the pieces 1, 2, 3, 4, and then matched them up so that way when I put them back on, I would put them in the exact same spot. But the tape fell off along the way, and it ended up not being completely necessary. But this process is good in general to match up parts as needed. But once I got it all apart, it was pretty flimsy. There were very few pieces, which actually just one piece that actually had glue that was still good. So it surprisingly took me a long time to get it apart, but part of the reason was they had 3 finishing nails inside, which were thicker than most finishing nails, and then the head was screwed on with just flat, like machine screws, so not wood screws, and that explains part of why it was so floppy. But this is the one piece that did get glued. So overall, the pieces that were there were in good shape. There was no big structural problem or anything like that we found. So when I put it back together, I did not use any nails, and I actually did not even fill these holes when I finished. Kind of left it so it had plenty of character. So here you can see it's just really dirty, and it's got the impression from something sitting on top of it, and then the holes from where the nails were. So the first step was to scrape each of the pieces and get off all the dirt and remaining lacquer that may have been on there, which I don't think there's much of any left at this point. Then just some soap and water to clean off the shell, so to speak. And just that little bit, you can see there was a lot of grime and dust and dirt on there. So after that, the first step was to use some crud cutter to get rid of the pieces that were really stubborn, and then I used some leather cleaner, and this stuff goes a long way. It took quite a while to actually wipe off the excess. I put it on there pretty thick, so it took me a while. Once I got that off, it started looking much better very quickly, and then I used leather conditioner so that way it would keep the leather from cracking, drying out any further, and overall kind of keep it in good shape. So I feel like it looks much better already, and I kind of pounded on the leather to see if I could force the whatever was underneath it to move around to that indented spot, but it didn't work. So after the shell was clean, took all the pieces outside, sanded them down, and I did not want to get rid of all of the dings, so I left a good bit of them for character, especially on the head and the piece where it connects. And then after using the orbital sander, I went with just hand sanding because it was kind of hard to get into the crevices. So you can see, not too bad. There's some big portions of this piece where the head screws into it that are kind of missing, but thankfully no splinters on this side. You're not going to see that either. It's going to be on the bottom and inside portion. So here's where I've made it a little more complicated than was necessary. So what I did was use the calipers to measure the hole where the screws had gone into the head, and from there found a drill bit that was that size, a little bit bigger. So the reason I made it more complicated is I should have just drilled a hole the size of my dowel, but instead I drilled a hole that was slightly bigger, which at an angle here too. They were at an angle, that's what that scrap piece is for. But they were slightly bigger, so then from there what I did was put it on the dowel on the lathe and turned it down until it got to the size that I needed. So again, I should have just used a bigger drill bit, but I was bored and wanted to try this out. After I got it down to the size I needed, I cut it off, and it was still just a little bit big. So after I'd taken it off the lathe and cut it, I put it into the drill press and then sanded it down a little bit to make it fit even more snugly inside that opening that I drilled. But clearly I didn't fasten in there strong enough. So once it was sanded down where it was going to fit in the opening, I pulled it out from the dry fit, added some glue, tapped it down in there, and cut it off flush. Had I known that this dowel was going to end up looking like it was two separate colors, I would have turned it a little bit more and made it kind of flow with the grain. Again, you're not going to see this, but it's just one of those things that, had I known, I would have done it a little bit differently. So you can see what it looks like. There are the two colors I'm talking about. There's pretty flush. And again, that side's kind of rough, but nobody's going to see that. So after all the pieces were sanded and ready, wiped them down with mineral spirits to get rid of any kind of dust and debris. And then from there, I took a long board, which I said scrap wood at one point in a previous recording of this video, but it was not scrap wood. I did buy this piece. So this is oak. The store where I bought this lumber doesn't sell pine, so I had to get oak. And then I used two pieces, which I ended up gluing together and then having some dowels to hold them, make it a little more strong. So you can see I didn't need to cut too much out of the second board, but I didn't think it was going to be quite as strong, so what I did was I moved the good leg up, so that way I'm using about half of each of the two boards that I'd cut. So they're going to be scrap anyway if I cut into them, so I might as well go ahead and use as much as I could. So then looked at the grain and figured out which way I wanted it to go, lined it up, and traced the outline. So here's a little trick I learned from another YouTube video, that if you tap in some finishing nails, not full, just tap them in a little bit, and then what you're going to do is cut them in half, and that leaves a point. So once you get them cut, you want it to have it sticking out, and then you take your second board and you're going to tap it down onto the nails that you've cut. And what will happen when you do that is it'll leave an indentation on the second board. And from there, that gives you kind of a pilot hole, so to speak, for your drill bit. Again, you're not going to hammer it down so that the two are flush, just enough so that way it leaves a little indentation in the second board that you can see here. So X marks the spot. Just take your drill bit, drill down. For me, it was an arbitrary depth. I didn't measure it at all, just drilled it down, and then I took the dowel, and the first marking I'm putting here is the depth of that board. The second marking will be the depth of the second board. And then I measured those, added them together, and made a third marking, and that would be the total length needed when you combine the two. So it works for me. It didn't have excess, so if you cut it just shy, you should be perfectly fine, because the whole goal here is just to keep the two boards from slipping any further. So I intended to edit this down where you didn't see as much of the glue up as I left in this video, but oops. So once the two dowels are in place, just put some glue in the other hole, put glue on top, spread it all out, and then get the two pieces clamped up together. So what I did is clamp the two side to side and then clamped them right on the seam, so that way it would keep it about as flush as possible. And I do recommend not doing glue up on your expensive table saw. That was a boneheaded mistake. I should have just gone over to my silicone mat, which is intended for glue. Oops. So after that, took the board and ran it through the planer because it was going to be thicker than the other leg. And then that step actually keeps me from having to do a whole lot of sanding on that glue or any kind of scraping. So I think I said I traced the outline earlier, but I did not. So now, after it's planed, I trace the outline and then clamp the board to my workbench and just got my saw, cut it along the marks, and it's good to go. I didn't clamp it down hard enough, you could tell there. But so here it looks like I forgot to put some glue underneath and just relied solely on the nails that were in there originally. Which, it's going to be fine. It's just a matter of, I prefer to use wood glue anyway. Then you are going to see an extended version of the staining of all the pieces here. So I did not stain any of the edges that I'm going to glue. The glue bonds a whole lot better if you don't have any stain or paint on those sections. So some of these boards actually have kind of a really cool tiger stripe pattern to them. And then the board that you see closest to me on the left of the legs, that's the new board, which is the oak, and then the one up top is the old pine. So after I got this new board stained up, it ended up looking a little bit lighter than the original board, so I did take it and add a second coat to it. But all in all, I really did like this finish. This color worked out really well for me. You can see the one piece of painter's tape that laid around. You can see the difference in the tone, so that's why I put this second coat on here. And I did get a little stain on the eyes, so when I got finished with all the staining, I took some acetone on the Q-tip and got the little bit of stain that was on the plastic and got that off of there. So afterwards, the guard dog and I went outside, got the polyurethane, and sprayed 3 coats. In between each coat, we would lightly scuff it up with some Scotch Brite. I didn't notice until later that I never actually stained the bottom. I don't think it was stained originally, so it's not a big deal. It's just a matter of it's not stained where the other pieces are stained to finish. So. Kind of bummed I left the painter's tape on there, so a little discoloration. But kept all the original hardware for most of this, not on the part where the head connects. I used wood screws for those, and that didn't work out well for me. You'll see a really quick version of what happened there. So here the trick to make sure I lined up the head nicely is I put the painter's tape on, poked holes in it where the screws should go, and then took the board that it's going to screw into and lay the painter's tape down and used it all to mark the holes there. I didn't line it up well though, so it's not as nice as I would have wanted it to be, but yeah, it serves its purpose. But this is the same trick that you'll see some people use when they're hanging pictures on their wall. They'll put tape on there, and then wherever the 2 picture hangers are, they'll put that on, transfer that over to their wall so they don't have a bunch of holes in the sheetrock. Same principle, and it typically works. So here, just using some other boards to space it, and then when I put this on here, I can clamp onto the other boards and have room where my clamps can go underneath, because the piece is too small to put it on top of the workbench and clamp without doing a whole lot of maneuvering. And here you can see I notched two grooves into a scrap piece of wood, so that way they would fit the contours of the angles, and then I could clamp it with two flat parallel surfaces, which is the scrap wood and that shelf board underneath. It was easier said than done, so I tried to finagle it multiple times by myself, and that did not go well for me, so I ended up having to recruit some help. So here you'll see the second set of hands, and it did a good bit more moving than I wanted it to do during the process, but it ended up being okay, and I just wiped off the excess. I don't know why I was so stubborn and had to put the head on now versus waiting until it was all glued up. But anyway, I should not have done that, and as I was doing it, using some wood screws, they weren't going in nearly like I wanted them to go, and actually one of the heads snapped off, so that was very frustrating, and I obviously left that one in there, didn't try to break it out, and then put a third. So nonetheless, end of the day, this is what the guy looks like. I'm pretty pleased with it. It's a pretty unique little piece, and I figure it'll get some use at some point. But there you go. And after this, you'll see some before and after pictures here. Thanks for watching.